Hare Krishna, everybody. Welcome once again to the Engaged Bhakti podcast. I'm your host, Krishna Kishore Das, aka Christopher Fichi, and I'm really honored today to have one of my dearest friends and mentors, Garuda Dasa, with us for today's conversation. Garuda, say hello from your wonderful home there. You're in Virginia.
Yes, I'm in Virginia, yes, in my study.
Yeah.
So greetings to all.
Yeah. I'm always saying, some of the other podcasts we've done with Yogeshwar. He had a beautiful bookcase behind him. You have a beautiful bookcase and your diploma. And we were with Rancher Prime the other day, and he was recording from his Bhajan Kutir. I don't quite have the same bookshelf tattva yet, but I'm working on it.
Yes, well, you're a newly minted PhD, so we'll give you some time.
Yeah, I need to, get a job and make some money to buy more books.
Yes, indeed. That's how it works.
So we're going to have a really nice conversation today with Garuda about the Bhagavad-Gita and sama-darsinah vision, and a tricky conversation, as it were, about our conditioning, which is that messiness of our devotional path that is often hard to deal with, but essential to deal with. But a quick introduction for Garuda, for many of you who know him and cherish him, and many of you who may not know him. Garuda Dasa, Dr. Graham M. Schweig, in his parallel Leela as a scholar, has been a disciple of Prabhupada since 1972. He was one of the first devotees that Prabhupada authorized for academic training, working alongside Rupa Nuga Prabhu Bhakti Sarup Damodar Swami. And he's done graduate studies at the University of Chicago, Harvard University. He received his PhD from Harvard in comparative religion with a specialization in Krishna Bhakti studies, which is also what I'm doing in some ways too. Yeah. And Garuda has been accepted numerous invitations to speak on the philosophy of the Gita and comparative religion at the world-famous Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. over the last 12 years. Published over 100 pieces, including several books and several forthcoming books on Krishna Bhakti. Some of his most well-known works, he was this book, especially A Living Theology of Krishna Bhakti, which you helped to complete, which is Tamal Krishna Goswami's doctoral dissertation, and a book that I treasure very much, especially as a scholar. And Garuda has also published his own books on the Bhagavad-Gita. Do you want to hold up your Bhagavad-Gita translation that you have there?
Yes, here we go.
Bhagavad-Gita, the Beloved Lord's Secret Love Song. It's an amazing, amazing translation of the Gita. And also this really wonderful book on the Dance of Divine Love, India's classic sacred love story, the Rasa Leela of Krishna from the Bhagavad Purana. So
we'll hold that one up.
There we go. A prolific author and scholar, and a dear friend of mine, and a dear friend and mentor to many of us in the scholarly community of Chaitanya Vaishnava scholars. Garuda, the first thing I wanted to ask you was, Srila Prabhupada put a lot of importance actually on devotees who were qualified to go into that strange, wonderful, sometimes not so wonderful, mysterious realm called the academy, with a capital A, as we say. And of course, he encouraged many devotees who had the adhikar, the desire for education, to become educators, to do so. But it was especially very important to him that devotees gain these kind of academic certificates, qualifications. You said once in a lecture that getting a PhD is kind of like a danda for this age. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, first of all, your own story, about in your own kind of journey as a scholar and devotee doing the scholarly seva. And if you wanted to share a little bit about what you mean by that, like getting a PhD is like a danda for this age.
Yes, yes. Well, great. Well, first of all, Krishna Kishore, it's an honor to be here, and to, of course, hang out with you is always enjoyable for me. So this is just another chance to hang out, as I just said. So, as you know, my journey began when I was 13, and my parents took me out of middle school. I wasn't doing all that well, and they put me in a private school in Potomac, Maryland. And the headmaster said, well, why don't you get ahead and take my course over the summer? I said, okay. And I said, what is the course on? And he said, linguistics. Mm-hmm. Well, what 13-year-old knows what linguistics is? I mean, I didn't know, and I didn't ask because I was too embarrassed. So I signed up for the course, not knowing what it was about. Suddenly I found myself studying Hittite, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and ancient Arabic and the structure of languages, this and that and the other. And then he shifted to India, talking about the Vedas and ancient yoga texts. And my ears inexplicably perked. And I said, I have to know more about this. I just have to know. And the sound of Sanskrit just exhilarated me. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., where, frankly, every teacher of yoga came to the United States. I mean, they'd come to Washington, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and L.A. generally. So there probably is not one teacher I haven't seen, heard speak, attended, gone on, retreats with back in the 60s. So while Prabhupada had just come to America from India, I was in Washington exploring all these other paths. So I was a serious practitioner of yoga, and I just wanted to know more and more. In fact, to the point where I dropped out of high school. I asked my parents if I could drop out of high school. And they said, well, they're very educated people. And they said, well, Graham, what will you do all day? I said, I will study sacred Sanskrit texts and I will meditate. Now, it's probably, a parent's worst nightmare to hear a kid say that. They said, well, what about college? I said, college is supposed to happen. It will happen. So anyway, they, of course, allowed me at age 15 to drop out. And that's exactly what I did, is I meditated and read all day. And that happened for a year. And then I ended up applying to Johns Hopkins, and I went back to school. Why? Because I felt I needed more intellectual equipment to understand the language and the history and the culture. So even back then, before becoming a devotee, I knew I needed to gain the intellectual tools to be able to go deep. And I had been reading Bhagavad-Gita, 13 different versions before I came across Prabhupada's. The 13 I bought from a store downtown in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., a pilgrimage that I would take once a week down to this bookstore, sit on the floor and read all day and buy a few books at the end of the day. So it was back then known as an occult bookstore, an occult bookstore. This is not a phrase found anymore.
Well, there's still the occult section, like if you go to Barnes and Noble.
Maybe they call it a cult. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. But
it's the same. Yeah, it's the same kind of books, but it's not.
The same idea, in a sense. So, ironically, my sister, 2 years younger, was working in Georgetown, and she said she got this big book. She got this big book, Bhagavad-Gita. She said it's huge. She said, I'm not really that interested. Why? I know you're interested in this book, so I'm giving it to you. That's how I got Prabhupada's Bhagavad-Gita. And it was, shortly after receiving Prabhupada's Gita that I became a devotee in the movement. But before that, I had gone to India when I was 18. And this is where I landed. I went with 5 other friends. I lost them because I was traveling. It's a long story, but I lost them and ended up in Vrindavan on the eve, on Janmashtami Eve. And this is where, I had such an intense desire to dive into the life of the Gita and to know more about the Bhagavad Gita. And I just received Prabhupada's Gita before I went to India. So I came back from India after quite a 3-month trip where I had long hair and a beard, and I shaved it all off in India because there was a guru who was willing to initiate me in Vrindavan. I said, hey, this is a lifetime opportunity. Let me do this. Anyway, he gave me a Shiva Mantra. I was very upset. So I was very upset. I said, do I leave one of those little ponytail things in the back? Or he said, either way. I said, well, why either way? Isn't the Krishna Bhakti, the ones with the little tuft or the... Anyway, so I chose to leave. Well, my hair was very long, so it was quite a long shika. And then I came back to Baltimore, where Johns Hopkins was, and I heard about the temple just 3 blocks away from me. And I walked up to the door, and a young lady answered, and she said, "Hari Bol Prabhu." I said, "I'm sorry, do you speak English?" She said, "Yes, of course." "Oh, okay. I'm here to visit the temple." She said, "What temple are you from?" I said, well, I just got back from Vrindavan." She said, "Oh, New Vrindavan." I said, "I know of a New Delhi, but I don't know of a New Vrindavan." She said, Vrindavan? I said, "Yeah, Vrindavan, India." And she ran and got the temple president, and the rest is history. So the temple president then was clever enough to give me some books by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Sri Chaitanya's teachings, 2 volumes. I have those books to this day. And it showed me how much there was to learn, how much depth there was to Krishna Bhakti, in addition to Prabhupada's Gita. And so this is where I devoted my life fully and dropped out of college after the 3rd year and joined the ashram. And then I first saw Prabhupada in Henry Street up in New York when he came through, and that was quite an experience. That was my first time. But I had the good privilege of being able to visit with Prabhupada, be in his room for hours, right at his desk, right just a few feet away from him, listening to him dialogue with various guests, many morning walks. There are some pictures of me with Prabhupada on morning walks. So it's been quite a journey, Krishna Kishore. It really has.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's get back to the Danda.
Yeah.
Okay. The Danda happened in 1975. I took the academic sannyasa ashram. Okay, we want to call it that. Okay, that happened. The Chaitanya, as you know, the Chaitanya Charitamritas were coming out one at a time every 2 weeks. It was dramatic, unbelievable. And whenever all the devotees, I was living in Philadelphia, all the devotees would be asleep in the ashram across the street. And one other devotee and I would sneak out of our rooms in the hallway at night and read for hours from the new Chaitanya Charitamritas that came out. And it was extraordinary. We were in some kind of bliss, so much that even though we only got 4 hours of sleep before Mangalarti, we were just in heaven. We loved reading, these beautiful volumes that you can see behind me, I think.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, so we got to chapter 7, where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was taking up the sannyas ashram, the Danda, to address the intellectual class of persons. That was his sole purpose, to command the respect. Now, obviously, just carrying a Danda doesn't command endless respect. People have to see what kind of person you are, and so on. But when I read that, and when I had heard that Prabhupada was interested, of course, I was part of the formation of the Bhaktivedanta Institute with Swarup Damodar, and there was a lot of emphasis on scientific qualification from the devotee scholars. But then Prabhupada was interested in a Bhagavad college in Mayapur. And Ravindra Swarup said, look, why don't you finish your BA and you can be my first student in Mayapur in Bhagavad College. So that's where Ravindra Swarup was as temple president in Philadelphia, just so happens, We were both there.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ravindra had to finish his PhD. So I ran the temple while finishing my BA at American University, which was 2 hours away.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly the idea of the Bhagavad College got canceled.
Mm-hmm.
I said, but look at this. Mahaprabhu took sannyas because that's the same as the PhD. What commands the respect of intellectuals in the society now? It's the doctorate.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Prabhupada spoke about, he wanted leading scholars as devotees. He wanted his devotees to be leading scholars in the field.
Mm-hmm.
So you get all these messages, Krishna Kishore, and it's like, this is obvious.
Yeah.
And then my parents said they'd be happy to pay for at least part of graduate school. Of course, you'll get scholarships, blah, blah, blah. So I decided to apply to 4 schools, doctoral programs.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a very fanatical thing because I was insecure, because I was the only one, I was the first devotee to actually go back to school.
Mm-hmm.
Swarup Damodar had already been getting his doctorate.
Yeah.
Siddhartha had already gotten his doctorate from Cornell. Madhava had gotten his doctorate from Georgetown in chemistry. Ravindra Swarup was on the way to getting his doctorate. He went all he had to do is write the dissertation. So I was the first one to go back, even as an undergrad, finish my BA, and then suddenly the brakes were on.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, look, there has to be a reason for this. I decided to apply to, University of Chicago and University of Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
Berkeley, and Harvard. At that time, I got right into the doctoral programs at Penn and at Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at the time, Krishna Kishore, I kind of took that for granted. Not everyone gets into a doctoral program in those places,
Yeah.
right? Usually you have to prove yourself at the master's level, right, and then go back and get a master's and a doctorate.
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't have any perspective.
It's like getting second initiation when you get first initiation, kind of.
Exactly. It's kind of right. Exactly. Both at the same time. Right. Yeah, exactly. But you know what I did? There's always a statement of purpose
Mm-hmm.
that you have to write, as you will.
Best thing to write.
Exactly. It's a crazy thing to write.
Yeah.
The first line I put is, I am an initiated priest for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, well known as the Hare Krishna movement. That's the first line they're going to read.
Bold.
I figured if they can't accept me like that, I don't accept them. Isn't that something? And then I wrote something about what I would want to do and so on. Well, famous scholars at Chicago accepted me. Hans van Buitenen, A.K. Ramanujan,
Mm-hmm.
Edward C. Dimmock, who wrote the foreword to Bhagavad-Gita as it is. And I said, it's obvious. I belong there. So I went. I first consulted with Rupanuga, who was my GBC at the time. He said, I feel Prabhupada would just be so pleased, this infiltration.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got a master's degree there from the Divinity School, and Rupanuga called me up mid-year, and he said, you know what, Garuda, I don't think any devotee is ever going to do this because no one's crazy like you. Crazy enough to do it. So he said, you have to go to Harvard. In other words, it's such name recognition. And I said, well, what about Oxford? He said, no. He said, Harvard, because education in America is the best. So you go to the best in America, and that's Harvard. Well, as it turns out, at that time, Harvard had wonderful opportunities for studying Krishna Bhakti. So I got in. And anyway, over the years, climbing up and getting Smithsonian grants, and it took me a long time. And I got involved with temples, on the way, wherever I was, whether it's Chicago or whether it was Boston. So it took me a while to get it, but 3 masters and a doctorate later, there I was. It was a heck of a journey.
It always is. It always is.
Yeah.
It's,
I'm sure you have your stories. Yeah.
well, it's been so amazing the past few years becoming part of this family of Vaishnava scholars that we have with yourself, and
Yeah, the ones that Rupanuga said would never be there.
yeah, we have
Right.
every year when we gather at the American Academy of Religion conference.
Yeah.
It's always such a wonderful thing. We always try to find the nearest Govindas to have dinner together.
That's
And
right.
so it's really a joy in it, and just I'm learning so much from this family of devotees who are doing this seva. One of the things that really struck me in Living Theology of Krishna Bhakti from Tamal Krishna Goswami's dissertation was he was making a case that, like, for example, if I go to the library here, Butler Library here at Columbia University, or Burke Library at Union Seminary, there are the books about, you might find a set of Bhagavatams, you might definitely find some of Prabhupada's direct translations of different books. You might even find some of the smaller books like Science of Self-Realization. But generally books about the Hare Krishnas or about Prabhupada are sociological. So you're going to see a lot of studies of the movement going back from the 70s to some of Burke Rocheford's work recently.
That's right.
And Tamal Krishna Goswami says that's one lens of study. We need to consider Prabhupada as a theologian. And I just particularly using that term theology, a living theology, it's a statement of some kind. Not that theology and philosophy are two different things. We often say the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. Yes. But this term theology means the study of the divine. That's literally what it means. And the field of theology, as someone who identifies as a theologian and constantly has to stick up for it, as many of us do, that it's not this antique thing you find in an antique store. It's a very living science. Right. And having come to learn over the past few years about systematic theology, constructive theology, comparative theology, I just continue to gain a deeper and deeper appreciation of Prabhupada as this theologian. And the work that he was doing in his translations is even taking a kind of a step back, or a step in a historical sense, is historically unprecedented in so many ways what he was doing. So I'm wondering, like, you want to just maybe say something a little bit about what it means to look at Prabhupada as a theologian, or the theological. That was one of that's especially from Tamal Krishna Goswami's dissertation, like that's what continues to stick with me. And I feel that in many ways our family of scholars is doing that service to help present Prabhupada as a theologian, but the tradition is a theological sense as well. Bhaktivinoda Thakur is a theologian, the Goswamis as theologians. Is it okay to use the term theology when we say, when we're approaching Krishna Bhakti, is it okay to use the term theology?
Yeah. Well, when Tamal Krishna Goswami, departed this world rather suddenly and unexpectedly, it was only 2 or 3 days that the trustees of his estate immediately called me up and said, "Can you complete his dissertation?" Mm-hmm. And at the time, we didn't know whether he could be awarded a posthumous doctorate or not. It turned out that Cambridge doesn't do that, But it can be said by his advisor that he has completed the doctorate. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, I helped him complete the doctorate. He left 5 chapters that were fairly rough, and he did not have a title for his book. Mm. It took me months to figure out the right title for the book. So a living theology of Krishna Bhakti are extremely carefully, well-chosen words from within his work. I found him using the phrase living theology several times. As I read through the book, several times myself. And it occurred to me that that's really what he's doing, is really trying to understand the living theology of Prabhupada. What is a living theology? Well, the 3 main areas of theological inquiry, as you know, is there's a philosophical or natural theology on the one hand. There is next a symbolic theology or dogmatic theology, which is doctrinally driven theology. Mm-hmm. And then there's applied theology, like liberation theology and ethics, theological ethics, and so on. So Prabhupada's living theology is an unsystematic presentation of theological teachings that are derivative a little bit from the first, natural, a lot from the second,
Yeah.
and quite a bit from the third.
Yeah.
So a living theology is, and yet I would say that this is unsystematic. Prabhupada was not a systematic theologian. Krishnadas Kaviraja Goswami could be called a systematic theologian, as he synthesizes all of the teachings from the Goswamis and even other shastras and so on. Quite a remarkable work. And by the way, that was the master's thesis I wrote on the Chaitanya Charitamrita that Prabhupada received from me. And he was very pleased. He was quite sick at the time, so he was on his bed, but he was still going through the pages of my master's thesis. And he heard my letter as I was on my way to Harvard. He also got a letter from Rupanuga Prabhu. The last letter that Rupanuga ever wrote to Prabhupada. He had received 100 letters from Prabhupada, more than most devotees ever, except for maybe Brahmananda and Satsvarup. But the last paragraph of his last letter was all about me. Going to Harvard and establishing that theology, and this gets to your question, establishing that theology is not simply Christian. We have a theology, and we're ready to contribute that now. And so Garuda is going to Harvard to establish just that. That's what he told Prabhupada. So Prabhupada said to Satsvarup, please tell him I am pleased he is preaching on such a high level. So those were encouraging words that I took in those days where I was, slaving through my various degrees. So theology, yes, is a good word for us, though we're not used to using it.
Yeah, and I think that that's those of us, again, when I say those of us who, at the core of our brain, hearts, identify as theologians, we have to kind of stick up for this what used to be the queen of all sciences, as they used to say back in the pre-modern days, as it were. So as I've been explaining, we've been talking a little bit about what this podcast is about. It's been important for us to emphasize that within our teachings, I think what we're trying to do humbly in this podcast and these conversations and exploring this concept is to say that there are actually elements of our teaching which encourage social engagement. It's not that. Prabhupada can be very clear. I mean, for example, look at this purport that I've seen passed around recently, where he says, this is from Canto 3, Chapter 5, verse 11. Anyone who misunderstands this perishable body to be the self and who works for it in the name of sociology, politics, philanthropy, altruism, nationalism, or internationalism, under the false plea of the bodily conception of life, is certainly a fool and does not know the implications of reality and unreality. And there's another purport which I think maybe illustrates a little bit what I think unpacks a little bit what Prabhupada's trying to say. This is from Canto 1, Chapter 5, verse 32. He says, we should therefore learn to dedicate our activities unto the mercy of the Lord and accept him either as personal Brahman, localized Paramatma, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, ideally. It does not matter what one is. One must dedicate everything in the service of the Lord. If one is a learned scholar, scientist, philosopher, poet, etc., then he or she should employ his learning to establish the supremacy of the Lord. Try to study the energy of the Lord in every sphere of life. Do not decry him or try to become like him or take his position simply by fragmental accumulation of knowledge. If one is an administrator, statesman, warrior, politician, etc., then one should try to establish the Lord's supremacy and statesmanship. Fight for the cause of the Lord as Sri Arjuna did. And putting those, kind of contrasting those purports or bringing them into kind of a comparative thing here, I think what Prabhupada's saying is that it's important that we don't reduce or dilute our practice of bhakti to mere altruistic work or political work that is solely focused on the body or the bodily condition. But he does encourage from the second purport I read that to say that even if you are a politician, for example, but if you're a scholar, whatever is your sphere of life, that it's our duty to synthesize, the way I interpret this is our duty to synthesize our teachings with the field of engagement that we're in. And I wanted to ask if, when you hear, like, for example, Prabhupada in his purports talk about avoiding mundane welfare work, what does that, like, that term mundane gets also tossed around a lot. And I'm wondering, like, this is a kind of fundamental question to this podcast. Is it possible for us to engage socially as devotees? And what are the ways that we could possibly create that synthesis of entering into, like, a movement or even participating in a movement like Black Lives Matter, but doing it in such a way that we can help to enhance the cause from the teachings of our tradition? Is that possible?
Yes. In fact, I would respond to that with a resounding affirmative. And not only that, I would even add to the resounding affirmative that it is an exigent necessity. That we cannot remain in our little shells in our bhakti worlds any more than Arjuna could remain on the field talking to Krishna indefinitely. Krishna, let's just, you and I hang out, okay? Let's ignore all these soldiers, all these weapons. Just you and I hang out, okay? No, that's not what happened. Arjuna was trying to negotiate his very difficult seva and his dharma. And so he took shelter of Krishna in order to do that. So the process is that we go from the outer world of conflict to the inner world of self and transcendence, and then even deeper to the innermost world of the heart in which divinity resides. This is our process. And once we take that journey within, then we take the journey without. We return to the world with greater strength, greater vigor, greater vision, greater clarity. And then that challenge, then we'll still be challenged, Krishna Kishore, and that then motivates us again. Go within, go deep within, then come back out.
Yeah.
It is a circular process.
Yeah.
If one simply dismisses issues of social concern in this world, tossing it out as if there's too transcendental to it, they are in fact not only not transcendental, they are succumbing to the inner forces that controls them, which are the conditioning forces that are the very things that we're trying to get beyond and become purified of. So I don't buy it.
This point about conditioning, I want to return back to this in just a minute, but I also wanted to ask you about, so the verse, a verse, of course, was a touchstone for me and for many of us, is the sama-darsinah verse from the Bhagavad-Gita. If you have your translation of it handy there, would you mind reading it?
Sure. Vidya vinaya sampanne brahmane gavihastini shuni chaiva shupakecha pandita sama-darsinah. And I believe, let's see, in a Brahmin endowed with learning and gentle conduct, in a cow, in an elephant, even in a dog, and in one who cooks dog, which is a horrible thought, but even in one who cooks dog, okay, wise ones see the same. Okay, so a sama-darsinah. Sama-darsinah is the plural, as you know. So these sama-darsinahs what we have to understand is that by virtue, this is epiphenomenal. The ability to see
this, what that means, epiphenomenal, because I don't even know what that means.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so epiphenomenal means this is hardly the primary thing. It's a secondary outcome of the primary thing. So sama-darsinah, to be able to do that, Krishna Kishore, we learn in our texts that this is a matter of being filled with an abundance of love. The ability to see equally and to be so caring for all types of people. And Prabhupada says, true love is love for everyone and every being. True, he says this in lectures.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want me to prove it sometime, I can show you the sources. But he says it. In fact, he says, to love means to be concerned for the other person's benefit.
Mm.
That is real love. I love you for your benefit. You love me for my benefit. If I so-called love you for my benefit, that is lust.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So the difference between lust and love is if I befriend you, Krishna Kishore, because I want to use you for me, that's lust.
Mm-hmm.
But if I truly care about you, I've left myself behind. And the only thing I care about is you. So the opposite, or the antonym of ahankara, where it's me-centric, or I should say I am centric, okay? I am centered upon me, ahankara. So this would be tatkara or anyakara. It's how should we say, alter-centric instead of egocentric. And the bhakti process is a process by which we become purified enough to fill up our own hearts with love coming from the divine, to where we can afford to love all in front of us. So you see, there's a necessary precondition for sama-darsinah.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah. Now there's a critique, a very constructive critique of this verse, which I think helps to clarify what it means to have love for all, because that's something, love is this very potent word. It can be used and misused in many different ways. And so one of my mentors and one of your colleagues, our colleagues, Anantanan Rambachan, who's a wonderful person, brilliant Hindu theologian.
Yes.
In the book of Hindu Theology of Liberation, he makes a point, and I'll read his comment here. He's making the point that, especially so in this verse, there's a person always tacked on to the end, the swapaka, who is, I translate that as someone who's outcast. I think Prabhupada also does that in his translation too. Right, which also has obvious connotations to the caste system in India, but also inspires one to think about anyone who's outcast in different elements of different societies around the world, people of color, women, poor people, I mean, just across the spectrum of race and class and cultural meanings and social hierarchies and all of that. So he says, and I just find this very interesting, and I really interested to hear your response to this.
Sure.
As most contemporary commentators in the Bhagavad-Gita verse do not interrogate or problematize the category of outcast. And again, this is from his book, A Hindu Theology of Liberation.
Right.
So he says, the problem here is that when social categories and physical forms are treated as unreal, there is little incentive to change or to transform these. So he's making a point there that he's interpreting that some interpretations of this verse, for those who have sama-darsinah vision, that while they're seeing every living being, humans, animals, bacteria, whatever, as wholes, that in that vision, the rest of the bodily categories, bodily realities fall away. But he says such a reading of this text implies that the liberated will not see the distinctions that are in fact made in the suffering inflicted on the basis of such distinctions. One may argue, this is his argument, that the liberated can and should see the underlying unity of all beings, but also the tragedies that follow in the world when this unity is not discerned and its social implications not discussed. If liberated persons do not see injustice, they can never become agents for social change, and religious teaching becomes irrelevant to social reality. So even a liberated person in his argument doesn't automatically become a positive agent for social change unless they're able to have that discernment of why suffering happens because of different bodily prejudices, of things like racism, casteism, patriarchy, sexism, speciesism. And this is, I think, a bold kind of challenge to those of us who live by this verse to say that we can't just overlook why the person is outcast.
Okay. Very good. I love it. This is really so important, and I'm glad, Krishna Kishore, you're focusing on these things. And of course, this is your area of expertise too, liberation theology. So my first response is that, when I translate Schwapake, Schwapaka, I don't translate it connotatively with the word outcast. You notice that? And even though it may be a strong connotation that a translator would utilize such a word, the fact is, if you and I encounter someone who cooks dog, you and I would find it very unpleasant.
Yeah.
So it's not that someone like that would be, we wouldn't necessarily welcome an invitation to their home while they're cooking dog. On the other hand, we can appreciate that they're a spiritual being who is struggling with conditioning, a conditioning that would cause them to cook dog, to eat dog. So it's no longer a matter of caste for a liberated soul. It's about an individual person's struggles with their own conditioning, with their own conditioned tastes, their conditioned habits, their conditioned pains and hurts that cause them to even commit terrible acts. Cooking a dog is not exactly a good act in our eyes, but holding people in concentration camps like we've got right now in Texas is not a good thing. Systemic racism is not a good thing at all. I mean, these things are terrible. Human trafficking is extraordinarily, there are no words there's slavery still going on. We're still trying to get rid of the residual effects of slavery from 400 years ago. But human slavery is rampant around the world. I mean, full on human slavery. So this is a terrible, terrible place in so many ways. A liberated soul, if he or she is truly liberated, cannot avoid addressing these things. They have to. Now, that doesn't mean that every liberated soul has the obligation to go march on Washington, for example. That may not be their particular way to address it. That's fine. But to ignore it, to dismiss it, to pass it off, is to be insensitive to others. And what did Prabhupada say? It's about caring for everyone. Everyone. Now, as someone who's had children, a good comparison is if you happen to have 10 children. I don't have 10 children, but I can be grateful for that. But if I did, a true loving parent would love each child the same. They would be sama-darsinahs. Okay? But each child struggles with different things, as we know as parents. They come in from a previous life. They have their own tests, their own challenges. So It's about both. You have to attend to the enormous variety of challenges that face humans on the one hand, and on the other, there is that love which allows you to see them the same as a parent can see every child as the same loving being.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're pointing to this sense that we have to both be able to embrace each other on this level of relationship. Our relationships are intimate relationships, because what is bhakti if not anything but intimacy and relationship? Like, that is what we are trying to serve the most intimate relationship of the divine couple, and manifest that kind of love in its various ways in our own lives in this world and then beyond. And
yes,
but I think sometimes what frustrates me, and I think I've heard this in conversations with other devotees, is that we tend to focus a bit too much on individual behavior. Like, for example, with and we've had a lot of conversations around words like lust and surrender, and about how to kind of like unpack those, or maybe retranslate them in different ways. But
right.
for me, I get frustrated, for example, with lust as being so much just about like, bodily temptations and whatnot. And I think the way that we can too much focus on kind of behavior and judge each other in that way. And I like the sense that you put it about this kind of basic existential level. It's like, in this relationship, am I exploiting you or am I serving you? And if I'm exploiting you, that is lust. But I think what we're trying to encourage with these conversations, and what I've gained so much nourishment from, is learning about how to take these teachings of the Gita and use them to see how lust, greed manifests in these systems of injustice, of evil, of adharma in the world. And again, it's not everybody's path is to get the PhD, not necessarily everybody's path is to become a historical scholar. I would still insist and argue that it's certainly of great benefit to many of us to have a sense of where we, at least in this embodied sense, where we come from and the histories that we're connected to.
Right.
And the social realities that we're embedded in. For some reason, this was coming to mind. I remember when I was in the Bhaktivedanta ashram in what is now the Bhakti Center in New York, Devamrita Swami was visiting us one time. And we had like a movie time with him. But what was the film that he showed us was this documentary, Inside Job, which was about the financial crisis from the last financial crisis from 2008, and how the whole thing was created by all of these, basically the greed in the financial industry, and how it just has completely rocked society. And he didn't particularly have his whole purport to showing us was that, in the 16th chapter, it talks about demonic personalities. Here's an example of this in the world. They're right down the street on Wall Street, and we should be aware of these things as devotees. And I think also, for me also, the 16th chapter of the Gita is such a powerful explanation of how greed and lust can manifest in social evil. In fact, for many, many years, I'm going to out myself politically here, although I'm sure people realize this anyway, but for many years when I would read that chapter and read about the Asuric personality in there, I would always think, who's a good example of this? Donald Trump, he's a good example of this Asuric personality. And you see the power that he has now. And there's something about the Gita, the teachings of the Gita, that, especially in that chapter, but I think also when we look at this verse we've just been discussing, or these categories like lust and greed, we have to hold them both individually in our relationships, but also have the capacity to see this socially in the world and see how we need to respond to these social realities.
Yes, beautiful. My simple definition of lust, which can ramify in all kinds of directions, is lust is the inability to be sensitive to the thoughts and feelings of other living beings, humans, and by extension, other living beings. That's the whole point, is how to be able to care about what's happening with another person. The ability to really be sympathetic, maybe not empathetic. We may not be able to identify or relate to another person's suffering. Sympathy has a far wider application, a true sympathy and compassion. how does, and we can understand ontologically the conditioning for which we would have so much compassion by going back to our own theology and understand that there's the antaranga shakti, the external, the internal energy of the Lord, right? The bahiranga shakti, the external energy of the Lord, and then the tatastha shakti, the living entities. What no one tells you is what the word tatastha means. Okay? Let's break it apart morphologically. Okay? It's very interesting. Tata means a slope, a bank, an embankment, something that is slippery. And sta, as you know, means situated. We are all beings that are fundamentally in a kind of insecure liminal position of tatastha. We're shaky. And you know, when you're about to fall, I mean, if I were about to fall now, I would probably try to grab onto something, oh, Krishna Kishore, I'm falling, and I try to grab onto something. So the idea is many of us are here in this world because we're grabbing onto the bahiranga shakti, not the antaranga shakti, which is the energy of the Lord, divine energy. And so as to Tatsa Shakti, even in this world, we're shaky. We're persons that are fundamentally shaky and insecure and flickering, like the under part of a spark is dark and the upper part is light from the fire of the divine. We're flickering beings. And so even in the Yoga Sutra, which I'm translating now, it talks about swarasavahi, and that's where lust comes from. Lust comes from, I've got to hold on to my existence. I have to protect the energy is going from the outward to me, right? But then he says in the next aphorism, pratiprasava, reverse that by allowing the self to flow outward. That's sama-darsinah.
This reminds me, there's a saying attributed to Martin Luther, the founder of Lutheran, the Lutheran branch of Christianity, where he describes, you're saying that turning inward, which is not, there's kind of two types of turning inward. The turning inward, which is the kind of contemplative turn, the synthesis of our experience in the world, and bringing that back into our heart and trying to understand how that waters our Bhakti Lata Beach, for example, with compassion. But then Luther describes, this is the Latin, the cor curvatam in se, which he says is the heart turning against itself.
Right. Okay.
And that's something many of us, especially in the past few weeks, there's Christian Twitter and then there's Hare Krishna Facebook. And in the Hare Krishna Facebook world, especially as the Black Lives Matter movement has been gaining this incredible energy. And it's been really amazing to see a lot of devotees express a deep and realized compassion and concern. But you're also seeing, unfortunately, I see this with devotees, I see this with family members, I see this with people, your Facebook friends that you don't even know how you ended up being friends with.
Yeah.
But the racism comes out, the sexism comes out, and I think the way you're explaining this is really nice, because in terms of, it can be kind of bewildering. It's like, how can someone, for example, devotee, how can someone who's a devotee still have racist attitudes? Well, it's perhaps because they have this real deep conditioning of prejudice
that's right,
they keep clinging to. And I know, this is something, I often talk about as a scholar and public intellectual, as a white-bodied American. I have to be doing my whiteness work. And sometimes that can come off, in a tradition like ours, which says we're not the body. Like, why are you so concerned about your white body? Well, it's part of that practice for me, and I think for others, of trying to understand, first of all, to heal and something within ourselves and to help heal these social ills, but it's also a spiritual practice. It's like, I don't want to cling to this whiteness thing that's been part of my karma in this body. Like,
right.
I don't want that to be something I'm clinging on to in that kind of temptation to fall in this world.
Right.
So it is a kind of spiritual, I find it to be it's part of my sadhana in a lot of ways, as strange as that may sound.
Yes.
But I just think like it's how, this is like the question I think is really one of the core questions we want to explore in this podcast is, how do we help our fellow devotees and help our fellow human beings to be cured of this prejudice? Like, what is it in our tradition that can really help us cure each other of these prejudices that hold us back?
Yeah. Okay. Well, excellent. I mean, our process is to become more and more purified of our conditioning. And so it's ironic. You in what you just said, there's kind of an ironic parallel. On the one hand, to be having a relationship with things in this world on the basis of lust means I bring things to me. I use things. Everything is for Garuda to use, okay? But in spiritual life, we do want to use things in spiritual life. We want to engage things in spiritual life. Yukta Vairagya, for example. Yeah. So the irony is, in order for us to be self-realized, we have to be, in some sense, truly egocentric, centered on the true self. We have to fill that up. We have to know the self. We have to nourish the self. We have to realize the self. The irony is that once the self is filled up with that knowledge, and even better, filled up with the divine presence and the divine love, I mean, the love coming from the divine, filling up one's heart, then one can forget about oneself. Then one is in a place of the heart's abundance, and then one can be tatkara instead of ahankara, tatparya, and so on. So many different phrases in Sanskrit that illustrate self-giving. I translate bhakti as the process of offering the whole heart to the divine in all beings.
Would that be like, we often hear the teaching of paradukkha dukkhi, which, how would you translate that, and what does that mean? Is that?
Yeah, that's sympathy. That is describing a sympathetic level of compassion. Mm-hmm. One can really, feel the suffering of others. And so, in other words, one sees others, one loves others and cares about others. But if you care about others and that other is suffering, then this is something that you'll feel. Mm-hmm. You'll recognize that in yourself, as the end of chapter 6 in the Gita talks about, to see in others, to see what you have in yourself, you see. Mm-hmm. That is a beautiful understanding of how sympathy works. And it works through the agency of Paramatman.
Would it also be, it's one thing to see the suffering of others, but is it possible to also translate paradukkha dukkhi as actually experiencing the suffering of others or the happiness of others?
Feeling. Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily, it's sort of like a resonant string on a sitar. Yeah. The one string is suffering, let's say, okay? And then it triggers in someone who is receptive, whose heart can afford to be receptive to a trigger, like the sympathetic strings, a tarab, as they call it in India, the sympathetic string, allowing others' feelings and pains and so on to trigger something in you because you're sensitive. Again, this comes with developing sensitivity at a very high level. And that's what bhakti is about. Mm-hmm. That is what bhakti is about. See, I think what devotees are challenged by, I see some devotees getting too involved with the outer world, and then losing sight of how they need to nourish themselves, strengthen themselves to address the outer world, And one is, by the way, commensurate with the other. To the extent that you are grounded within your own heart, it is to that extent that you can go out and be effective. But if you're overdoing it on the outside, you're going to lose track of what's on the inside. Then there's the other side. Poo-poo what's happening on the outside. Who cares? We're all going to die. You're too attached to the body. This is a Kanishta attitude, right? So all I care about is working on the inside. And this is very childish, and it's very Kanishta. But many devotees have to go through this stage. As unpleasant and insensitive. Look, a little child. Have you ever seen one of those mid-sized humans, like 5-year-old?
My sister has a couple of them.
You're around a couple. Okay, you've seen those. I've seen a few. We've raised a few, and so on. Those little 5-year-olds. They don't have the pranamoya. They don't have the sense that someone hurts like they do. They don't have that sense. So it's something that needs to get developed. It's the essence. It's really the essence of bhakti.
And it's something we all have to encourage each other to grow in that way.
Yes. And it begins in one-on-one, a dialogue.
Yeah.
Just like you and I are having. I hope I've been sensitive to your suffering in speaking with me.
I hope you're experiencing the joy that I feel.
Okay. Well, okay. I was wanting to see if you were suffering or not. Okay, good.
Well, Guruji, I've been telling devotees in these conversations, we're talking about the whole universe and beyond here, and it feels very much like we're having eternal conversations that have no beginning or end. But by the conventions of podcasts, we have to come to an end for this one at this moment. So I want to thank you, and we will definitely continue this conversation down the line in different ways. Hope you can be a regular.
Oh, there is a lot to say about all of these things, as you well know.
And our civilization is increasingly falling apart, so there'll be no shortage of things to talk about in relation to that. So, but thank you so much, and maybe next time we can continue to talk more about the theology and the kind of academic seva that we're doing. And I would love to, if I could. Sometimes it's said if you can turn one person Krishna consciousness, that's a success. If we can get one person to kind of decide to do some more scholarly seva and join our family from hearing our conversations, that'd be a great success too. But
indeed. Thank you, Krishna Kishore.
So grateful to you, and thank you everybody for listening. Check out our YouTube page and our Facebook. We have our first batch of podcasts you're experiencing here, and we'll continue on. And thank you very much. Haribo. Radhe Radhe.
Radhe Radhe.